Hello, this is Lauren Bailey, and I'm here to describe the core components of a virtual machine and how to leverage virtualization technology in a business setting. So, a virtual machine has an allocation of processing power, CPU, and a portion of the RAM, and a portion of hard drive space. And the way this works is you have what is called a hypervisor, or a host, that actually acts as an interface between the hardware and the machines themselves. And in the case of type 1, it's a direct connection between the hardware and the virtual machines. And in the case of type 2 virtual machines, you have a connection through a special program such as VirtualBox or VMware Workspace, which runs on a general operating system such as like Windows 11 or Ubuntu or Fedora or Mac OS. And it runs the programs, unlike an emulator that actually specifically runs a set of commands, and then it has the overhead from translating. But hypervisors don't do that. And whenever you set up, like Windows Server 2025 or 2019 or 2022, you actually have a transformation where the hypervisor becomes the kernel which you boot from, and then you boot into the management OS, which is another host on that is being provisioned, and it's strictly for managing the other virtual machines, allocating resources. And in the case of ESXi, it becomes the direct OS that you boot from. It's a hypervisor, and it manages the virtual hosts that exist on the machine. And it's one physical machine, but you have logical spaces and a certain amount of allocation of the CPU and RAM, as well as USB ports, as well as networking ports. So the hypervisor has to manage all of that. Okay, so people use virtual machines to protect their data and lower their costs of operating. Once it's up, you only got one physical machine to manage maybe 20 or 30 different virtual machines on a big server. On a small server, it might be just a couple of virtual machines. Usually, the type 2, you're going to have maybe just one or two where you're going to be running a program, maybe testing a program. Developers would be using type 2, but general people would be using type 1. Like, I would provision a lot of people with their own devices, remote desktoping into their type 1 virtual machines. And even if somebody's processing a lot of confidential data. If somebody gets their personal device, or they get a thin client stolen, somebody steals a thin client, they're not actually getting the data. The data is still on the virtual machine. So chances are they steal the thin client, and they end up with something they can't use. So there's no data on it, and also data stays in the network all the time. It never leaves. Even if they're connecting through VPN to get to their virtual machine. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to talk about is the server roles, and the features are critical for defining a server's functionality. And I'm going to describe the difference between a server role and a server feature, and how you determine which roles and features a server needs. So servers run programs, but they run usually specialized programs that basically serve the clients. In other words, you might have an FTP server that will actually go and allow people to upload and download files, and they store their data. They might have backup data. A file server is a little bit different, and you might have another server that acts as a print server. Now, some servers will have multiple roles, like a DNS server will be a domain controller, and could also be a DHCP server that hands out IP addresses to clients, because these are services that clients need. Now, a feature, of course, would be things like what programs, what operating system it runs, such as a Windows Server 2025 might be a domain controller. A Ubuntu server might simply act as a web server. So somebody connects to it, and they don't usually connect to the Ubuntu server via remote desktop. They'll connect to it through SSH or port 22, a secure form of terminal, and they'll type in commands to keep the server updated and maybe put on a database, such as like MySQL, and they might put in like Apache for the web services. They'll install PHP to run the different code that is needed to apply the user interface with the database. And they would, of course, use Linux as the operating system that one runs off of. And of course, it's going to need to have certain features, such as it will have to have certificate services to make secure connections. You'll have to have logins for each of the users that connect. Like, for instance, a learning management service such as Moodle or Basecamp or Blackboard and Canvas. They are all learning management services. But the role would be that of a web server, but the features will be, okay, it runs a database, it runs a web services, it runs authentication, it runs security certificates, so on and so forth. Okay, and like you can actually have some servers be part of a domain. You may or may not do that with some servers. Like there's no need for a public web server to be part of a domain, so you might actually have that in a demilitarized zone off the domain, but still kind of on the network, but on a different subnet. And that would be done through routers and switch trunks and whatnot. Okay, so other servers that have a need for different services, they too may perhaps be clients of other ones. So if you, let's say, have a file server that's part of a domain, you would have that go to the domain controller and check the usernames, and they would have certain rights assigned by group policy to that server that is part of a domain. And you may have another server that is a wireless access controller, which manages access points, and it has to go to the domain, so it's going to be also a client, but it will determine whether or not you meet the requirements for getting onto the Wi-Fi network. So it needs to have radius or 802.1x services running on it, but it will go to Active Directory, and it will have to have Kerberos to request the ticket granting ticket to process the authentication of the user trying to get on. And that's usually done with WPA2 or WPA3, depending on whatever protocol it's running on it, and that protocol would be a feature. Okay, and then the next thing I'm going to go over are domains, and that are fundamental to a company's infrastructure. And I'm going to explain the purpose of Active Directory and how it facilitates resource management within a domain, and give an example of a common task you might perform using Active Directory. And I've already kind of gone into it a little bit, but just to clarify, domain is an autonomous system that is under an administrator or a group of administrators' control. And they usually sign up. They might go through IANA for, let's say, you have Joe's Auto Shop, .com, and the domain controller might be joe'sautoshop.local. That's where people within the LAN authenticate to joe'sautoshop.local, and it is for applying group policies and other settings to different groups and organizational units within the domain. So at any rate, I will actually have the domain controller authenticate those staff members and contractors that work for JODA, and the people outside, of course, different. And basically, it will define who gets access to what and what level of access. For instance, I told you about Wi-Fi. Some people might get the Wi-Fi access to the internal staff members, and it will have, and that Wi-Fi will actually have access to internal servers, whatnot, and it will be provisioned through things like autopilot, through Intra ID, and enforcement of those remote clients will be through Intune. So, at any rate, by the time you enforce, make sure these remote clients that are connecting, are deemed compliant. Then Intune will say, yes, go ahead and enter. You got a compliant ID, and you got a compliant device. Welcome aboard, and you get in and you do your work. Like a lot of sales reps will use stuff like that. At any rate, I hope this is sufficient. At any rate, I could talk a lot more about other ways to secure it down and all that, but for purposes of this assignment, I will call this one good. Thank you for listening. Bye.